Now, just an announcement before we begin. Okay, so first thing I just want my Patreon or really future Patreon members to know is that apparently Apple is, greedy as heck as usual, just like YouTube's, and they're requiring that Patreon use their in-app purchasing system to remove all other billing systems from the Patreon iOS app by November 2024. So it's coming up in a few months. And this means that starting in November of this year, new memberships purchased in the iOS app will be subject to Apple's 30% App Store fee. So this will increase the prices apparently or something like that. And they're, forcing creators like myself to increase fees already. Now, I'm not sure if that's optional or not. If it's optional, because my costs, looking at my Patreon, so you just go to YouTube, you can click on this for my links, for my link tree, right? And that brings up the various links and stuff like that. Or you can go to my link tree, PayPal, and on Patreon. On Patreon, I've got 3 tiers, and they're kind of, again, these are in Canadian. When you put it in, I put them in US to make it more reasonable. I think it's $5 US, 12.50 or something for the Real Seekers Plus, and then $20 American for the Real Seekers Beyond tier. That's kind of already high for just sort of starting out. So if it's possible, at least for the time being, if there is a new member who joins after November 2024, I will absorb the cost for the time being, and I'll just go with incremental increases due to inflation every year or so, or something like that, or every couple of years, or something like that. I think the prices are high enough that I can absorb this 30% fee, and it'll just come out of my pocket for that, because it's not just about making money for me. So that's the thing. Now, for existing members, because let's face it, most of you guys don't support me financially, and that's fine. It's your money, you earned it, you've got better things to do with it, or perhaps you have other causes that are more worthy or more pressing. But thankfully I do have at least 2 Patreon members. So, Brian with an I, and there's somebody else. So from what I understand, this change will not impact your existing membership at all. So everything will be the same. And if you're just paying through your computer, you're not paying through this iOS app or whatever, then again, it won't affect you whether you're a new member or not. But yeah, I just wanted to make you aware of this change, because I do have a couple of Patreons, so I owe it to you guys. But yeah, it's just annoying. 30%. That's where greedy little YouTube, that's what they charge. They're a conner. That's why I didn't join YouTube, and I joined Patreon instead, because they had lower fees. But now they're becoming greedy rich idiots too. So I don't know. Looks like I should have just went with YouTube anyways, because Patreon's the same thing. The good news is I do have another option. I do have PayPal, which is lower fees and gives you full control. Kind of thing, right? On Linktree, you can just click on PayPal, or on my YouTube right there, you can click on PayPal me. And I have had a couple of supporters, a one-time payment from Hugh Ferry, and Annette Cloutier has given me a few payments through PayPal, where you control the amount, you control how frequently or infrequently you donate and stuff like that. And thankfully, it's less fees. It seems like it's under my control kind of thing. So hopefully there will never be a 30% increase on PayPal or something. So yeah, that's it. That's it for the announcement. Like I said, I have no control over this. This is happening on everyone's Patreon. They're forcing people, at least to use this iOS Apple app. By November of this year, they're increasing prices by 30%. So just be aware that most creators, if we do have a choice, they're going to choose to charge you as the customers, because they need to recoup their costs just to maintain the current level of money that they're getting from you guys right now. Like I said, I'm just going to leave it alone for at least the next year or so. I can absorb this cost, because my prices are kind of higher than normal people with like a $2 or a $3 tier and stuff like that. So, okay, that's it for business. So let's get into our last lesson of logic. This one's for you, Tyler. This one is on Logical fallacies. Excellent. So what are logical fallacies? Well, essentially arguments can be defective in many ways, right? We studied various ways that a deductive argument or an inductive argument could be said to be weak. Some bad arguments are weak because they are logical fallacies. What's that? Well, logical fallacies are essentially common errors in reasoning that undermine the logic of an argument. In other words, they are arguments that either one, exhibit a faulty pattern of logical inference. So, in other words, one of the premises is irrelevant, and therefore you can't infer the truth of the conclusion from the premises themselves. So they exhibit a faulty pattern of inference. And at the same time, logical fallacies are nonetheless frequently offered by the layman, by the fundy lay atheist or skeptic online, by the typical non-educated person, someone who's never taken a critical thinking and logic course like you guys have. We've already seen two examples of a deductively invalid, right, where they have a faulty pattern of logical inference, either affirming the consequent or denying the antecedent. In general, a fallacy is a faulty pattern of inference because the premises don't provide adequate support for the conclusion, whereas in good arguments, the premises should be both relevant to the truth or falsity of the conclusion and acceptable or justified or reasonable or rational to believe. Whatever word you want to use, we'll go with justified. So the logical fallacies come in two main categories. There are fallacies of irrelevant premises. These are logical fallacies that say there's a problem with the logical inference because the premises are totally irrelevant as to the truth or falsity of the conclusion. So you can't make that logical move from the truth of the premises to the conclusion itself. And then secondly, there are fallacies of unacceptable premises. Again, unjustified, unreasonable, irrational premises in one way or another, even though they're relevant. They are argumentatively speaking unacceptable for one reason or another. Here's a helpful little visual listing from Professor Dr. Andrew Hunter, thank you to him, listing the 17 fallacies that we are going to go over, plus I've added a bonus one. But again, this is a first-year university course, so Tyler, I know he's done a lot of research into logical fallacies. He's gone way beyond. Look, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of logical fallacies out there that one can learn. Obviously, as a first-year university course, we focus on 17 of the most common ones, the ones that are, most basic and that are used most frequently, especially in online internet debates between a fundy lay atheist and a Christian critical thinker. And you can spot these readily, right? So we have the fallacies involving irrelevant premises. We have about 12 on this side. We'll look at those. Then we have the fallacies involving unacceptable premises. And we've got about 5 of those that we'll be looking. So let's start with the fallacies of irrelevance. What premises that are irrelevant for inferring the truth or falsity of the conclusion. In other words, there's a faulty inference here. So the first is called the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is arguing or assuming that a claim is true or false solely because of its origin. Okay, so it's not saying that the origin of a thing is always totally irrelevant in all cases. And in fact, it can be used in some cases to make an argument and that sort of thing, at least in part. And so here are some examples. So firstly, the study found that 80% of women who took the drug had no recurrence of breast cancer. But that doesn't show anything since the study was funded by the company that makes the drug. So in this case, the origin of this study is the company who's trying to make a profit from making it. So therefore, we can just dismiss the study as being a fallacious. Well, again, the fact that the company did it says nothing about whether or not the study is in fact erroneous or not. It could be true. Maybe the company did a good, credible study. You've got to look at the study on its own merits. Another example, we should reject that proposal for solving the current welfare mess. It comes straight from the NDP, and the NDP are, in Canada, they're essentially Jagmeet Singh, sellout Singh, that corrupt loser of a politician who supports tyrannically against democracy and what everybody wants. The people despise this party and sell out Singh because he props up undemocratically Jason Trudeau, the most hated prime minister in Canadian history that everybody wants gone. But we can't get rid of him because the NDP, which is essentially if you're an American, the Bernie Sanders party. Bernie Sanders had his own political party. It would be the NDP. So it's the radical left have their own party here in Canada. And, beloved old Jagmeet, the leader of the NDP, this sellout, basically sells out the Canadian people and voters and says, no, I know everyone wants me to get rid of Trudeau, but I'm going to keep him in power because I know if I call an election, I will get voted out, and then I won't get my pension fund. Pathetic, Jagmeet, pathetic. Okay, this isn't about politics, but there's an example for you, right? So in this case, we reject the proposal for welfare because it comes from the NDP. In the origin, the NDP are welfare communist hippies, so we can't trust any proposal these guys give. Therefore, we should reject it. Well, that's the genetic fallacy. Next, we have the fallacy of composition and the fallacy of division, which are mirror opposites of each other. So the fallacy of composition is arguing or assuming that what is true of the parts must be true of the whole. So notice that word, must be true of the whole. That's where the fallacy comes in. Sometimes it is the case that what's true of the parts is in fact true of the whole. So it's not always a fallacy if you argue based on a characteristic of the part. So here's an example of the fallacy of composition, right? It's when you assume that what's true of the parts must always be true of the whole. So let's take this example here. Each part of an aircraft is lightweight, 10 pounds or less. Therefore, the whole aircraft as a whole is lightweight, is 10 pounds or less. Well, that's obviously wrong. That's obviously fallacious, right? That's committing the fallacy of composition. But at the same time, I could say, well, each part of an aircraft is within the Earth, is on Earth, and the aircraft as a whole is on Earth. Yep, that's true. So that's the key with these fallacies of composition and fallacy of division. Don't just assume that the fallacy is, well, what's true of the parts is true of the whole. That's always fallacious. No, sometimes that's correct. It's assuming that what's true of the parts is always, must, necessarily is true of the whole. That's where the fallacy comes in. Here's another example. The average small investor puts $2,000 into the stock market each year. The average large investor puts $100,000 each year. Therefore, the group of large investors as a whole invests more money in the stock market than the group of small investors as a whole. Well, that's obviously the fallacy of composition. No, maybe there are only 2 large investors, but there are 500,000 small investors in that group. In which case, 2,000 times 500,000, they donate $1 million, whereas the large investors only donate 200,000. One last example of this: every player on the Blue Jays is the best in the league. Therefore, it must follow that the Blue Jays are the best team in the league. No, just because they have all the best players assessed individually, that doesn't mean they work together to be the best team. Maybe because these guys are a bunch of hotshots, they can't work together. They're always competing with each other, and because of this, they suck. They lose every game. They don't work. They work against each other as a team, and because of that, they lose. The fallacy of division is the exact opposite. It's arguing or assuming that what is true of the whole must, that keyword must, always be equally true of the parts. So, for example, Jane is a human being. Therefore, every cell in her body is a human being. That's fallacious. Another example, H2O is wet. Therefore, the molecules of hydrogen and oxygen are also wet. Well, no, wetness is a emergent property of the whole. When you put Hydrogen and oxygen together in a certain relationship, it's based on the viscosity or how loose or tight the connection is of those molecules. That's what wetness is. It's epiphenomenal to the molecules themselves. It's actually based on the relationship between them, how close together they are or not, and how well together they are. That's what creates this property of wetness. So H2O is wet as a whole. Hydrogen and oxygen molecules are not wet themselves. Next, we have the fallacy of appeal to the person. In other words, the ad hominem fallacy. I love this baby. This is the fallacy that someone like Jay Dyer or a funny atheist or skeptic online will use. Heretics like David Russell, they like to use this, but basically they're so mindless, dumb, and stupid that they don't have anything substantive to say. So instead, they argue, well, we should reject a claim or an argument solely because of the person. Let's distract from the argument and say, well, you stink, or you're stupid, or you're a heretic. They highlight the person or some negative attribute or characteristic or circumstance or something like that, and dismiss your argument on that basis. And there are three different types of ad hominem fallacy. So you commit an ad hominem fallacy when you appeal to the character of a person, right? Or a property, a characteristic of the person. So when you attack a person's character or traits instead of providing evidence for the actual conclusion or against the argument. Based on circumstances, the premise merely points out something about the person's circumstances instead of providing evidence for the conclusion. And next we have this thing that's a fallacy in its own right called the tu quoque or quoque fallacy, essentially the hypocritical fallacy. And this premise, this is when you have a premise that merely points out that some claim is inconsistent with something else the arguer says. So instead of providing evidence for the conclusion of your argument, the point is that, well, your opponent may be a hypocrite. So a person disagreeing with your argument is a hypocrite. And this is generally speaking totally irrelevant to whether what that person says is true. So here's an example of each type. So character takes. Don't believe what Jack says about love. He's been a reckless pot smoker ever since I met him. Well, that's totally irrelevant. What does his being a reckless pot smoker have to say about his knowledge of love? Based on circumstances, here's an example. Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper says he won't change the gun laws, but you shouldn't believe him since this goes against everything his party stands for. So the circumstances are the Conservative Party is wanting doesn't want to change the gun laws. They want to let you have guns. They're not satanic like Jason Trudeau of the Liberals, who want to steal guns and take away the ability of the citizen to defend their innocent selves and to protect themselves from a tyrannical government or the evil satanic bad guys invading your house or what have you. Just because the Conservative Party stands for heroic self-defense using guns, maybe Stephen Harper's a sellout, like Jagmeet Singh with the NDP. Maybe Harper does want to change the gun laws, regardless of what his party stands for. So the circumstance of his party is totally irrelevant to what Harper. Finally, the tu quoque fallacy based on hypocrisy. We have an example here. Naomi Klein wears expensive name brand clothes. It follows that her concerns about excessive consumerism are just so much rubbish. Well, she's a hypocrite, right? So yeah, it follows that her little arguments are total garbage. That's the tu quoque fallacy. That's fallacious. A lot of people use this against environmentalists, and boy, I love sticking it to those people. They're horrible human beings, the way they act and what they do. Very annoying. But they say look at little Greta Thunberg, the little hypocrite. This foolish little girl has the audacity to tell knowledgeable world leaders what to do about the environment. And yet she's taken her private jet planes, has her expensive automobiles as a celebrity now. What a hypocrite. Therefore, we can just dismiss whatever she says about the environment. No, that would be no. If you want the truth to come out about the environmentalism being a wacko movement with how far they take it, you've got to make a substantive argument, provide premises that are reasons which are relevant to the truth or falsity of the conclusion. You can't just say, well, look at old Greta up in her private jets. What a hypocrite. Therefore, environmentalism is complete bunk. Okay, so the next fallacy, we need a little bit of background knowledge, and we've got beloved Class J Clay here, Class J Cray, sorry, and his slides. So this is relevant to the fallacy of equivocation. So before we understand what that is, there are a couple of technical terms here. So in philosophy, there is a difference between what we call ambiguity and vagueness of a word or an expression within a premise. So you have the beloved little picture up here. I'm a huge metal fan. And then David Russell over here saying, me too, man. Yeah, peace, dude. Or something like that as a heavy metal fan. So what's the difference here? So an ambiguous word or phrase is when the word or phrase can be used in two or more different senses. It has two or more meanings, right? So like in this case, I'm a huge metal fan. Well, that's being used in an ambiguous way, because metal fans could be this fan made out of metal, or it could mean, hey, I'm a fan of metal music, like Davy Russell here on the right. In contrast, a word or phrase is said to be vague when there's no precise cutoff point or boundary between when it applies and when it doesn't. So, for example, baldness or richness. Precisely how many hairs must one have on their head before they're considered bald? If you have 50 hairs, does that mean you're bald? Well, if you have 51, if you have 49, are you now bald? At what point are you rich? Or, what precise number or height does one have to be considered tall, and so on and so forth. So that's vagueness. Now, when we're evaluating arguments, it's important to note that merely appealing to vagueness alone and even ambiguity alone doesn't necessarily make an argument bad. But there is a particular type of ambiguity that applies where we call it the fallacy of equivocation. So the fallacy of equivocation is when a word or expression is ambiguous, used in two different senses within an argument, but appears to suggest otherwise simply in order to get to its conclusion. So typically this takes the form of you use the word in one sense in one premise, and then you use the word in another sense in a different premise in order to get to your conclusion. And typically pointing out that a word or expression used in an argument is vague is not seen in logic as a substantive criticism. So for example, all bald men are at risk of sunburn on their heads. Beloved Davy Russell is one rude dude that is bald and happens to be heretical too. Therefore, conclusion, David Russell is at risk of sunburn on his head. Well, it's not a good objection to say, well, that's fallacious because you said beloved Davy Russell's bald and that all bald men. But what does bald mean? How many hairs does David Russell have versus the definition of baldness? Does he have 52 versus 50? That's not a substantive criticism in logic. And in fact, it's kind of seen to be a tactic of an online atheist like Darren Lute. It's employing an argument stopper and is therefore irrelevant to the truth or falsity of the conclusion. It's not a fallacious use of terminology there. But ambiguity can be used, right? And I wish I had thought I had an example there, but okay, so here's an example, right? All laws have a lawgiver. Nature has laws. Therefore, natural laws have a natural lawgiver, aka the Lord our God. Now this is true. God is the creator of natural laws. But the argument itself is fallacious. It commits the fallacy of equivocation because in one sense, we're using the word all laws to talk about man-made laws, legal laws made by lawyers and judges and politicians. But in the second premise, when we're referring to natural laws, we're using that in a technical sense, in a scientific sense, to refer not to rules made up in a courtroom or within the legislature, but just general descriptions of how natural things typically act in ordinary circumstances. So the word law is being used in two different senses in each of those premises, and therefore it's ambiguous. It commits the fallacy of equivocation. Other fallacies, here are three ones that are related. So there's the appeal to popularity, arguing that a claim must be true simply because it is a popular belief. So here's an example. Of course, the war is unjustified. After all, everybody thinks so. So that's a fallacious appeal to popularity. That said, sometimes we do appeal to popularity or to a majority, and that's not fallacious, right? So here's one example. This isn't technically an appeal to popularity, but it may be appeal to them. Another word for appeal to popularity, appeal to the masses, right? Or a consensus. And sometimes that does make sense. So I will appeal to a scholarly consensus, whereby I don't think that's fallacious, because scholars, we have a reason to think, are probably en masse have a true opinion about something, unless we have reason to think that that consensus is not based on truth conducive reasons, but is based on bias or political persecution or pressure or social pressure or something like that, right? So I think that evolutionary theory is a lot like that. That scholarly consensus is totally meaningless because of provable bias in among the scientists. But even appealing to masses, ordinary lay people, or a certain group of people, that's not necessarily fallacious. So I will appeal to the majority of true Bible-believing Christians, accept these books of the Bible as being inspired. Well, in that case, because Bible-believing Christians are guided into truth by the Holy Spirit, we have a reason to think that the majority opinion there matters on the specific conclusion being made. And so long as I can prove that, so long as that's reasonable to believe that proposition or that premise about Christians and their majority opinion, then that's not a fallacious appeal to popularity. No, it's only an appeal to popularity when there's no reason to take the majority opinion as being relevant to the truth or falsity of the conclusion itself. And in this case, just what a bunch of know-nothing laymen think about a war being justified or unjustified, in and of itself, what do they know about what's going on in the ground in the Ukraine or something like that, right? So you could argue that, it's not a warranted opinion here, and you're just appealing to popularity in a fallacious way. Likewise, there's appeal to common practices. So this is arguing that something must be true or done in a certain way simply because it is commonly done that way, right? Or again, appeal to popularity, arguing that a claim must be true simply because it's a popular belief, and that's it, right? That's where the fallacies come in. That keyword is there, simply because it's the popular belief, or simply because it's commonly done that way. If you qualify that and say, well, it's not simply because it's commonly done that way, but there's good reason it has been commonly done that way, or there's good reason for something to be the popular belief, good reason that's truth conducive, then that makes a difference here, and you're not committing the fallacies. Same with appeal to tradition. Appeal to tradition is arguing that a claim must be true simply because it is part of a tradition. And a couple of examples here. I'll go over these examples, but the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Roman Catholic Church, loved to appeal to ancient early Christian church fathers and quote unquote tradition. Well, this is clearly fallacious, right? Unless they can prove there's a reason that good reason to believe that tradition is truth conducive in terms of the claims that the argument's making. Without that reason, it's just fallacious. And so, in point of fact, I do believe the Eastern Orthodox Church commits. They can't provide us any good reason to believe that the early church traditions are authoritative or truth conducive or inspired or reliably true in any way. And therefore, they are just making a fallacious appeal to tradition. Other examples. One living in the USA or Canada must get a Christmas tree every December. Why? Because traditionally, that is when one gets the Christmas tree, right? Traditionally, we've gotten Christmas trees in December. Or an appeal to common practice. Look, everybody eats pizza on Friday night, so we need to get some pizza to eat this Friday night. You can see these are clearly not good arguments. Another fallacy is the appeal to ignorance. And this is an argument which states or assumes a claim like this. We don't know that P is true, therefore P is false. Or conversely, on the other side, we don't know that P is false, therefore P is true. Both of these qualify as our appeals to ignorance. The main message here is, look, from ignorance alone, nothing can be inferred, right? And there's a nice little catchphrase. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence unless you can prove that we would expect not to have that absence. We would expect to have some evidence and not ignorance on the matter. Only then can our ignorance prove something, or a lack of evidence prove something. Now, here are some examples. No one has shown that ghosts are real, so they must not exist. Well, that skeptical little thesis and conclusion is logically fallacious. You're appealing to ignorance. Just like when the atheist or skeptic, like Darren Lute, says, well, there's no proof that science hasn't proven that God exists, therefore God doesn't exist. Ridiculous, skeptic, ridiculous. And it's the same on the other hand. Look, God must exist because science hasn't proven otherwise. Well, so what? And there's something here that I've just added in. So this isn't a part of the course, but there's also this invincible ignorance fallacy, also known as the fallacy by pig-headedness. And this is basically a deductive fallacy of circularity where the person in question simply refuses to believe an argument and just ignores any evidence given. And great examples of this are Fundily online atheists and skeptics like Darren Lute or David Johnson from Skeptics and Seekers, who simply refuse to accept any good arguments proving that God exists or that Christianity is true. They just turn a blind eye to all the evidence and arguments in favor, powerfully in favor of those arguments. You know, they've steeled their hearts to harden their hearts, whereby they won't even consider it seriously. They just nope, plugging my ears. No. I see nothing. I hear nothing. No. These arguments all suck. I just dismiss them out of hand. That's the invincible ignorance fallacy, or the fallacy of pig-headedness. Next, we have the appeal to emotion. And this fallacy occurs when emotions are appealed to instead of relevant reasons in an argument. Now, note, sometimes emotions are relevant evidence for a given argument, right? So I took a philosophy of emotions course. Sometimes our emotions are actually directly relevant to the truth or falsity of a conclusion. Also, with emotions, I argued that our emotions are, when aimed at certain moral questions, do provide us with moral knowledge. In that case, appealing to emotions, our gut level emotional reaction to certain moral situations is relevant evidence that provides us with limited moral knowledge. So it's important to note that just because someone appeals to an emotion, that doesn't automatically make it fallacious. It's only when that emotion is not considered to be a relevant reason, relevant with respect to the truth or falsity of a conclusion. So here are some examples, right? You should judge this person innocent. After all, she's a poor single mommy who didn't have any chances in life. And if you find her guilty, her life will be so bad and ruined. Appealing to your emotion. Pathetic. We don't care. Did she do the crime or not? You do the crime, You do the time. Irrelevant about feeling sorry for you. Or saying, look, I deserve a better grade than a D on my paper. My parents just got a divorce. If they see that I got a D, they will just blame each other and the fighting will start all over again. Give me a break. No, you got a D. You earned a D. That's what you're going to get, is a D. I don't care about your family situation. That's sad. That's heartbreaking. I wish you all the best. But that's irrelevant as to whether you deserve a D or not on this paper. Sadly, you'll find a lot of left-wing politicians, demon rats or Democrats and liberals, and they often have a lot of advertisements or base their political campaigns on emotion. How many times have political Democrats engaged in fear-mongering about Donald Trump being a dictator and, oh, he's Hitler in the flesh and stuff like that? It's just a constant appeal to emotion with left-wing politicians. Pathetic, really, pathetic. Okay, next up we have the red herring. This fallacy is a bit of a subtle catch-all fallacy, right? So a red herring just is, it's a meaning the premise is irrelevant to the truth or falsity of the conclusion. So, it's kind of a catch-all fallacy. It's something that occurs when irrelevant factors are present in a premise, but they go beyond the specific fallacies of irrelevance that we mentioned above. So this is red herrings kind of catch everything else that's not specifically named fallacy above or below with the straw man. And this fallacy is named after the smelly little fish, a red herring, that was used to throw hunting dogs off the trail, tracking either as a person or a fox or something like that. And, sometimes this is deliberate. Other times it's inadvertent or accidental that one will appeal to a red herring. But the solution basically is to bring the topic back to the relevant topics of focus. So here's some examples, right? So the federal government should bring in mandatory minimum sentences for a greater range of serious crimes. I'm telling you, crime is a terrible thing when it happens to you. It causes death, pain, and fear. And I wouldn't want to wish these things on anyone. Yeah, basically, what is, crime is a terrible thing. What does that have to do with bringing back mandatory minimum sentences? It doesn't. Or secondly, a lot of people think that football players are stupid and boorish. That's just false. You should have seen the fantastic game our team played last week. They scored 3 touchdowns before halftime. Well, your team, how their team played and how many touchdowns they got is totally irrelevant. That's a red herring, totally fallacious. What does that have to do with individual football players being stupid and boorish? Next, lastly, we have the straw man fallacy. And this fallacy occurs when an argument attacks a misrepresentation or a distortion of a person's real argument. So the misrepresentation is irrelevant to the worth of the actual argument someone's giving, and attacking this misrepresentation is, as we've seen before, is a violation of the philosophical principle of charity. So here are some examples, right? People who opposed the NAFTA probably just wanted Canada to banish Quebec. But we want Quebec to stay in Canada. Okay, so you're strawmanning people who opposed NAFTA and saying, well, the only reason they didn't want NAFTA to come in is because they wanted to banish Quebec. That isn't their actual position at all. No, they wanted to oppose NAFTA because somebody smart, perhaps like Donald Trump, who was a genius as president. I mean, he challenged NAFTA because, look, we have a mutual agreement, mutually beneficial agreement, but instead only we are paying this. And, Canada and other nations aren't paying what they agreed. You said 2% of GDP, pay it, or else NAFTA is not worth it for us. That was Donald Trump's argument, and he was right. We needed everyone to do their fair share, everyone to do their part, not just America to pay everything. So it had nothing to do. Donald Trump's opposition to NAFTA had nothing to do with, wanting to banish Quebec. That's a total straw man. Or here's another example. example, we should have conscription. People who don't want to enter the military because they find it an inconvenience, but they should realize that there are more important things than convenience. So this is saying we should have conscription. People who don't want to have conscription, it's just because they find war inconvenient. Well, no, that's a total straw man. Maybe people don't want conscription because they have moral reasons against fighting a war. I would never fight a war in the Ukraine, or I don't think we should be supporting this meaningless war in the Ukraine. We're not fighting a just war like in World War II against Adolf Hitler here. Yes, Russia shouldn't have invaded, but they were provoked. I mean, the West has been provoking them with the Ukraine. We had a mutually beneficial agreement, and we violated that first. Putin's just responding badly, but responding to our bad doing in the first place. So I would never agree to fight in the Ukraine or to fight against Putin in this World War III that the Democrats seem hell-bent on bringing us towards. I refuse to do it. It's not a moral war, and I would never fight and kill for something I deem to be immoral. Let's move on to the next category of fallacies then. Fallacies of unacceptability. There's something unjustified about these premises. And the first is the fallacy of begging the question, aka circular reasoning. You'll remember the beloved Jay Dyer, the ortho-bro leader of the ortho-bro movement. He falsely accused me of begging the question in our debate on the Sola Scriptura, which wasn't even a debate. It was more him interrogating me against the rules of proper format for our podcast. But what is this? Well, it's attempting to prove a conclusion by using that same conclusion as a premise in the argument, either explicitly or implicitly. In other words, the only reason you accept the truth of a premise that's used to support a conclusion is because you already believe the conclusion is true, and you assume its truth in warranting or justifying the use of that premise or premises. So here are some examples, right? So God exists. We know that God exists because the Bible says so, and we know that God wrote the Bible. This is viciously circular reasoning. It's the fallacy of begging the question. Or here's another example. Either God exists or the moon is made of green cheese. The moon is not made of green cheese, therefore God exists. Now, again, there's a test. Ask yourself, would I accept the premise if I didn't already accept the conclusion? Would I accept the premise that we know that God wrote the Bible if I didn't already believe that God exists? Well, this is explicitly assuming this premise, God wrote the Bible, assumes that God exists. Can't write something if you don't already exist. So this is the case. This is an explicit example. Or here's an implicit example, right? Either God exists or the moon is made of green cheese. The moon is not made of green cheese, therefore God exists. The only reason we accept the first premise that either God exists or the moon is made of green cheese is because we implicitly already accept the conclusion that God exists. That's the only reason we would accept this disjunction here. So yeah, those are the explicit and implicit versions. And it's important to note, look, the expression begging the question is used in a technical way here to refer to viciously circular reasoning. Not all circular reasoning is vicious. It's not all fallacious, right? So for example, if you believe in the B theory of time, or there can be retrocausation. So an effect causes its own cause to exist and that sort of thing. And under certain understandings of time travel or something like that, that may not be viciously circular reasoning. So it's only circular reasoning when it's vicious, when you're begging the question. So yeah, begging the question isn't just a way to refer to, raising a question about something or an argument or something like that. No, it's attempting to prove a conclusion by either explicitly or implicitly assuming that conclusion is already true in a premise for that conclusion. Next, we have the fallacy of the false dichotomy, otherwise known as the false dilemma. And this occurs when the premise assumes that a choice between two alternatives is both exhaustive and exclusive or both. Or exclusive or both, when in fact the choice is not. So let's go over these slides from Dr. Andrew Hunter. So remember, alternatives are exhaustive when there are only two options present, right? It covers every single option present. So an exhaustive list of the days of the week includes 7 days: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. That's an exhaustive list. A non-exhaustive list would be Friday and Wednesday. Well, it's non-exhaustive. There are 5 other days in that list of the week. Now, alternatives are exclusive when you can only have one or the other option, right? A non-exclusive would be you can have both options. So, and remember when we learned about disjunctions in logic, in lecture 4, I believe it was, in logic, unless otherwise explicitly or implied by the context, we assume the implicit use of or, not the exclusive use of or. So it's either I can have a sandwich or soup or both. That's the assumption we give in logic. The false dilemma is assuming that you can't have both. It's assuming the exclusive, falsely assuming the exclusive sense of or. So here are some different examples, right? So here's an exhaustive and exclusive. I'm either pregnant or not pregnant, right? This is an exhaustive and exclusive list. There's no third or fourth option or more options. You're either pregnant or you're not. And these options are exclusive. You can't both be pregnant and not pregnant at the same time. That's logically contradictory. You'll either get an A or a C. Well, this is an exclusive list because you can't get an A and a C, but they're not exhaustive because you might get a B, you might get a D, you might get an E, you might get an F minus, like that no good, filthy heretic, David Russell. He always gets F minuses, right? So it's not exhaustive. There are other options beyond an A or C. Listing all of Ryerson's degrees. Well, these are exhaustive because they list all of the degrees that Ryerson offers, but they're not exclusive. You can take multiple programs or multiple degree programs at Ryerson. I did, right? I've got my undergrad in business from Ryerson and my master's in philosophy at Ryerson. Finally, you can have a sandwich or soup for lunch. Well, these are both non-exhaustive and non-exclusive. You can have both, a sandwich and soup if you want, and they're non-exhaustive because they've got other things on the menu. You can have some chicken tenders or delicious pizza if you want to have that. So yeah, there's the list. So that relates to the fallacy of false dichotomy or false dilemma. When the premise claims or assumes that a choice between two alternatives is either exhaustive or exclusive or both, when in fact the choice is not. So here are some examples. You're either for us or you're against us. Well, that's not exhaustive, right? You could be neutral, and it's not exclusive. You could be for and against someone. You're either a teacher or else you're a student. Well, that's not exclusive because you can be a teacher and a student. I taught first-year university students this lesson in logic, these course in logic as a teacher. But I was also a master's student at the time, so I was both. These are hardly exhaustive, right? You could be a dentist, you could be a doctor. Finally, students must choose between getting good grades and having fun. Tammy has decided she wants to have fun, so I guess she's not going to get good grades. Once again, these lists are not exclusive. This is a false dichotomy, a false dilemma fallacy here. Okay, next we have the slippery slope fallacy. So this occurs when an argument claims or assumes that taking a particular step will inevitably lead to a further undesirable step or steps. And arguments that commit this fallacy typically have this form. Like doing A will lead to B, which will lead to C, which will certainly result in the terrible consequence D. So we should not do A. Now this fallacy makes use of the same logical inferences we did with the hypothetical syllogism, the pure hypothetical syllogism, the proper one, not the mixed definitions that no good heretic David Russell was talking about with modus ponens or modus tollens, right? No, there's only one hypothetical syllogism, and that's the pure one. If you remember, if A, then B, if B, then C, therefore, if A, then C. That's logically valid. Well, slippery slope kind of uses this same logical inference, but it does so fallaciously. So why is it fallacious, whereas hypothetical syllogism is valid? Well, it's because such arguments are fallacies because it's unlikely that the conditional statements are true. It's unlikely that one or more of the conditionals is going to be true in this case, right? It's unlikely to be true that B will lead to C or that C will lead to D. And therefore, it's unlikely that A will lead to D, right? So here's some examples. If we allow voluntary physician-assisted suicide, then tomorrow we'll have non-voluntary assisted suicide on unconscious patients. Then we'll have involuntary assisted suicide on unwilling patients. Soon, no hospital will be safe from helpful doctors. So this is clearly a slippery slope fallacy, right? If we allow voluntary physician-assisted suicide, then tomorrow we'll have that's unlikely to be true. Also, here's another example. If we befriend no good, filthy heretics like David Russell, then pretty soon we will see them as true Bible-believing Christians. If we see them as BBCs or Bible-believing Christians, then it's inevitable that we will let some of them preach their heresies in the church. So don't be friends with no good, filthy heretics like David Russell. Well, that's logically fallacious. It's unlikely that just because I become a friend, I've been friends with godless atheists and skeptics and unbelievers, and that doesn't lead to me thinking, oh, they must be Bible-believing Christians, and therefore, well, if they're Bible-believing Christians, they can preach stuff in the church and preach their heresies in the church unwittingly. No, these steps don't follow, and therefore it's a slippery slope fallacy. Now, it's again, sometimes it is reasonable to have the hypothetical syllogism, right? So some people, I remember this all the time about the homosexuals and the LGBTQ activist movement and how Christians were brilliant geniuses because they said, well, look, if we allow them to get married, if we allow this, then, you know, if we support and celebrate homosexual unions, what's next? We're going to be having pedophilia. We're going to be having, marrying animal. We're going to be supporting man-animal unions or woman-animal unions. And this was said, that's just the slippery slope fallacy. But actually it wasn't. Now we actually see the fruits that it was actually reasonable, the link, right? Allowing homosexual gay marriage, or more specifically, celebrating gay unions, and not led to immediately celebrating now we're celebrating pedophilia, right? We can't even call them pedophiles. We have to call them minor attracted persons. Get out of here. No, it's a sinful, disgusting, creepy sin of pedophilia, and if you are attracted to kids, I feel disgusted and bad for you that you've got to resist those urges. We do not celebrate pedophilia. Over my dead body will we ever celebrate pedophilia. I'm sorry. And it's just disgusting how certain homosexual activists, I will say, because there are gays against these groomers in schools, targeting kids with transgenderism, pedophilia. People are literally saying, hey, I'm married to my cat. There's a term for it, beasties or something, or furries. We have the furry movement now. We're being forced to celebrate all of these disgusting movements, and it all started reasonably inferred from celebration of gays at the Gay Pride Parade and stuff like that, and legalizing gay marriage and all this stuff. So was it a slippery slope fallacy? Not so sure now that we're looking back. Seems like it was reasonable to make those logical inferences and saying that the terrible steps would necessarily follow. Now, just to clarify, because I know this is controversial, just being as serious as I can, I do think it is a slippery slope fallacy to say, well, legalizing gay marriage would lead to the chaos that we're in. Was it a slippery slope fallacy about celebrating homosexuality and that sort of thing? No, that seems like that was a reasonable link, because if we celebrate and we claim there's nothing immoral about homosexual unions, well, that does seem to say, well, look, hey, marriage can be between anybody now, kind of thing, right? Like there is no moral objective standard of, the only sexual unions that are justified are between a man and a woman in marriage under God, making a commitment to each other for life. The sky's the limit. So I do think that once we got rid of the morality question from marriage or sexual unions specifically, and what is good versus evil or sinful as a union, that does lead inevitably to these celebrating, from a moral standpoint, celebrating and not condemning pedophilia, bestiality, transgenderism, and all this lunacy that we see from the left now, in this world that people are rightly disgusted by and reacting against. And dear goodness, it's a political year. I promise after the election's done, I won't be as overtly political. I'll go back to the way I was before, and stuff. But it's just so important. We need Trump to win. Vote Trump or you're insane. If you support Kamala Harris and everything she's done, illegal immigrants, crime, the economy tanking, on the verge of World War III, it's left-wing woke lunacy, which she says if you're not woke, there's something wrong with you. You need to compete to be the wokest or woker. That's her exact words. If you vote for Kamala, you're not a Christian at this point. There's something wrong. You're deeply ignorant, or there's something immoral about you. I would not have said that. I would not have said that even in 2020 for Joe Biden, knowing what we knew then and stuff like that. I wouldn't have said, oh, no, you're not a Christian or you're sinful to vote for Joe Biden. I would have said you're an idiot. I thought you were wrong. It's obvious Trump did a great job. You should be voting for him. But after Biden's reign, the Biden-Harris camp, 4 years in office, and everything they've done to destroy the world, the country and the world, if you are a Christian and you claim to vote for Kamala, you're not a true Christian. You don't care about people. You don't care about human beings as image bearers of God. You don't care about right and wrong. Or you're been living under a rock and you're deeply ignorant about the damage that's been done and the good that Trump has done. I can't see it any other way. Again, this isn't about politics, so what am I doing? So let's move on. The fallacy of a hasty generalization. Did I just make a hasty generalization? Yeah, maybe someone really is not following politics and it just has no clue about this. And the only thing they get is biased CNN lies and fake news, so they have no clue. But anyways, the fallacy of hasty generalization is when an argument concludes something about a group or set on the basis of an inadequate sample size. So here are some examples. All the cafeteria food is terrible. I had one burger there once, and it made me feel yucky. Well, that's an inadequate sample size, right? Or people that say, I met these two guys on a plane, and they said they were from Boston. They were total druggies. That must mean everyone from Boston must be on drugs. So this is clearly this is called a hasty generalization. No, what you need is a sufficient sample size to make a generalization, right? And it's sufficient based on the type of generalization you're going for. And remember, we looked at the verification versus falsification criteria for the type of generalization you're making. If you're making a universal one versus a majority one, either way, you need a representative sample, the proper representative sample, to make a generalization that's not a hasty one and therefore fallacious. Fifthly, we have the fallacy of faulty analogy. So we often reason by analogies, right? So we compare one thing to another thing, and specifically, we will then conclude that something about the target object by comparing it to the analog object. And when we reason by analogy, in order for it to be successful, essentially the thing we're comparing it to has to be relevantly similar. The analog has to be relevantly similar and sufficiently similar to the target, or else we commit the fallacy of a faulty analogy. So here's an example in terms of relevant versus a faulty irrelevant analogy. Premise 1, Susie did well in SSH 105 last year, critical thinking and logic course. Her sister Jane is similar to Susie. She is bright, relevant, and she works hard, again, relevant. Therefore, probably Jane will do well in critical thinking this year. Well, this is a good reasoning by analogy. But here's an irrelevant, it's a faulty analogy that's irrelevant. Premise 1, Susie did well in critical thinking last year. Her sister Jane is similar to Susie. She's tall and she's a vegan. These are both irrelevant factors. So you can't conclude, therefore, probably Jane will do well in critical thinking. So yeah, again, an argument commits the fallacy of faulty analogy when the analog fails to be both relevantly similar, and even if it is relevantly similar, it has to be sufficiently similar to the target. And here's an example of insufficient faulty analogies, right? So premise 1, Bill is an investment banker, drives a Lexus, is overweight, and votes conservative. John is also an investment banker, drives a Lexus, and is overweight. So John probably votes conservative as well. No, the similarities are not sufficient to support the conclusion in this case. Or another example, dogs are warm-blooded, nurse their young, and give birth to puppies. Humans are also warm-blooded and nurse their young. So probably humans give birth to puppies. No, that's insufficient. That's not a sufficient similarity. Last thing I want to leave you with, and this is not in the textbooks or the course, but it's a bonus. The logical fallacy. My goodness, this is common among atheists and skeptics online, or non-Christians online, or even orthobros online. They'll love to commit this fallacy. What is that? Well, fallacy happens when you either misdiagnose someone's argument as being fallacious, or you correctly diagnose them as committing a fallacy, but you make the supposition that the conclusion of a fallacy must be a falsehood. So, for example, fundamentally atheists and skeptics like Darren Lute will often say you're committing this or that fallacy, but they're just totally ignorant. They have no clue what they're talking about. They don't even know what the fallacy is that they're talking about. They'll say, oh, you're just begging the question, but they don't even know what begging the question is. Or with Jay Dyer and his orthobro buddies, they often said to me, they also misdiagnosed me when I was making my argument for sola scriptura. They claimed I was committing the fallacy of appeal to majority, or appeal to the masses, or appeal to popularity. Absolutely wrong. They don't have a clue what they're talking about there. But let's say they were correct. You're still wrong if you just use someone's fallacious argument as an excuse to dismiss the truth of the conclusion. No, look, there are lots of arguments with true conclusions, but whereby somebody gives a fallacious argument for them, just because somebody has argued poorly for a true conclusion. So here's an example, right? No good filthy heretics like David Russell often presume that simply because a claim has been poorly argued, or that a fallacy has been made by an arguer, that the claim itself must be false or wrong. Totally wrong. And here's the example. Recognizing that Amanda has committed a fallacy in arguing that we should eat healthy food because a nutritionist said it was popular, Elise said we should therefore eat bacon double cheeseburgers every day instead of eating healthy food. No, it's still true that you should eat healthy food. That conclusion is correct, even though the argument is fallacious that Amanda is giving here. So remember the fallacy. When you're memorizing hundreds or thousands of logical fallacies and you're spewing this or that's this, that's that, look how smart and cool I am. You're obviously wrong and stupid, and I'm right because you've committed this and that fallacy. Well, remember the fallacy. Just because someone's committing a fallacy doesn't mean their conclusion is wrong. And you'd be an ignorant fool if you assumed that, because you'd be committing your own fallacy namely the logical fallacy. So just be careful about that. And that concludes our course. We have now completed all of the units, and that's it. That completes our final last lesson in logic. All the course from critical thinking and logic, or SSH 105 at Ryerson University, is now completed. We've done our introduction to critical thinking. We've looked at the characteristics and classification of arguments. We looked at argument reconstruction. We have now finished our unit on argument evaluation. Congratulations, for free. You've just taken a secular university philosophy course in critical thinking and logic, and you didn't have to pay a single dime. So good for you. That's it. That's the end of the course. So once again, so just for people on here, please consider supporting me financially. I am needing some money, a little extra money, if you can afford it, on either on my PayPal or join me on Patreon. If you enjoyed this course, I know I've tried to make it entertaining with jokes about David Russell, the heretic, and atheists and skeptics, and all this stuff, and I've tried to make it a little bit entertaining for you guys. Otherwise, this is a tough course, right? First year university students often struggle with this course, and sometimes they actually fail. And learning about basic logic can sometimes be considered rather dry. So that said, it's foundational material. It's key when you're engaging in Christian apologetics or religious debates. Having that logical foundation and understanding how to be a true critical thinker is a key skill to have, or a set of skills to have, I would say. So I hope that you guys did find this useful, even if it was a little boring or dry at times and that sort of thing. It's a necessary precursor to being a good debater. And Tyler Fowler, my co-host on Faith Unaltered, I hope you enjoyed this show, because I did it namely for you. It was your request that I do this show, regardless of the fact that nobody is paying me to do so on Patreon. And like I said, I chose to do it, offer it for free on YouTube, because it is relevant to Christian apologetics, I think, and it gives you guys a taste test. So if you enjoyed this course, I've taken other undergrad and grad courses in secular philosophy, and I'd be happy to, if one of you joins my Patreon Real Seekers Beyond tier, I'm happy to, teach you guys some more courses, and maybe even make it a little bit more interactive, not just doing the videos, but I can give you guys tests if you're interested in that, or meet with you guys if you have questions and engage and interact and stuff like that. I can make it worth your while, because I know the Real Seekers Beyond tier is $20 a month. That's expensive, $20 US a month kind of thing, right? Or I'm also going to be posting up before the end of the month some more content to the Real Seekers Plus tier, which is in between the Real Seekers Beyond and just my Real Seekers tier. Brian with an I, he's in my Real Seekers $5 tier. Thank you to him, and he's getting all the Real Seekers content and stuff like that as part of that Patreon tier, the lowest tier. And Real Seekers Plus, I'll be doing religiously relevant stuff. So this will be going up on YouTube and on my regular Real Seekers Patreon tier eventually. But if you're a part of the Real Seekers Plus tier, you'll get bonus content, early access to my bonus content, or special access to certain bonus content and that sort of thing. So I'll work on posting, a few videos, 3 to 5 videos on my Real Seekers Plus tier, now that I've completed my Real Seekers Beyond logic course. And I'm not going to do any extra work until somebody joins Real Seekers Beyond. I do have one person on there who doesn't wish for their name to be mentioned. And I've reached out to them saying, like, hey, would you want me to, after I finish the logic course, would you want me to teach another philosophy course? Or do you have an interest in these philosophy courses that I've taken? And they said no, they're just happy to support me. So thank you to that person. But that means in the end, I don't have any paying customers who are requesting that I do further courses in the Real Seekers Beyond here. So I'm just going to leave it be with the logic course, unless and until somebody joins the Real Seekers Beyond here and requests, hey, I want you to teach another course, and I'll give them the options that I have. So just the real, I've taken a few philosophy of religion courses at both the undergrad and grad level. So I have three versions of that, plus a fourth course in philosophy of religion, science, and technology. I've taken, philosophy of anthropology or human being or humanity, ethics courses, epistemology, various courses, philosophy of emotions, you name it. I've taken a bunch of courses in various topics relevant to secular philosophy. So if that appeals to you, join me on Real Seekers as a Patreon on Real Seekers Beyond, and make a request, and I'm happy to teach another course by video and or do some interactive stuff if you would like that as well. So yeah, lots to offer you, including tests, but that's it in terms of Real Seekers Beyond. That's your taste test for that. Like I said, I'll be posting, hopefully before the end of the month, posting a few videos that'll give you a taste test for Real Seekers, the Real Seekers Plus tier. Nobody's joined that tier. So it'll give you kind of a taste to see if you're interested in joining that. I think that's about $12.50 American a month. So it's in between my low and high tiers. With that said, that's it in terms of the financial pitch. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the logic course. I think it's important. Thank you guys for joining, and have a good week, everybody. Take care.